This is Flashpoint History's War of the Worlds. This is episode 5, Abd al-Rahman III, the story of Camelot and subsequent catastrophe. In our last episode, we left off with the Emirate of the Umayyad, a dynasty that was founded in Spain by Abd al-Rahman I. He and his lineage ruled Al-Andalus through its ups and downs, but as our previous story ended, the emirate was mired in one of its darkest times, with a failing economy, hostile neighbors, and poor leadership. It was reduced to a fragment of its former self, and was fighting for its very existence. But the narrative does not end here. The story of Al-Andalus was far from over, and with the rise of Abd al-Rahman III, Al-Andalus would ascend once again under his shrewd political resourcefulness, his extensive military power, and his strong overall leadership. Rahman's success would change the emirate into a caliphate and would usher in a period of prosperity that some would say was not just a golden age of Islamic Spain, but a golden age of humanity as a whole. But like with many golden ages, it was simply the calm before the storm. When it comes to history, what defines a good leader? Is it the number of battles that they've won, the programs that they've enacted, or perhaps the monuments that they've built? Is it because, as one American president has said, they choose to do things not because they are easy, but because they are hard? Some historians, and it's usually the most critical ones out there, judge the past on how close a civilization comes to achieving, quote, paradise. But in that sense, all leaders would be failures, as there's really no such thing as the perfect state. Usually, one group's advantage comes at another's expense, and so this method is relative to those who are succeeding. But what if we use the following metric? What if we measure the state of a nation that one is given when they start, and what that nation is like at the end of their tenure? Wasn't it Caesar Augustus that was renowned as famously saying, "I found Rome a city of bricks, and I left her a city of marble"? Who would make it to the top of our list then? And for the more intrepid people out there, send me an email and let me know what you think about this question. Perhaps we would put Queen Elizabeth I, who stared down the near destruction of her country as the Spanish Armada rushed towards England. But yet, within 20 years, she not only demolished that great Spanish fleet, but put England into the fast track for global dominance. What about Abraham Lincoln, who at the beginning of his presidency inherited a country that was not yet 77 years old, but rather divided and about to fight a civil war that would cost over 600,000 American lives? And yet, as he lay dying from a gunshot wound to the head on April 15, 1865, his nation had been restored and slavery had been abolished. In the beginning of the 10th century, Abd al-Rahman III was given a country, or I should say an emirate, that was near total collapse. His grandfather, Abd Allah, was a reclusive, paranoid, lackluster emir who had run the country into the ground. The man had little connection with his people. He even had a separate passage and bridge built from his palace to the great mosque in Cordoba so his movements to and from could go unnoticed, but his faults were everywhere. The economy at this time was in ruins. Income had diminished across the board and was not sufficient to help maintain infrastructure or pay the army. Both languished in his tenure. Hugh Kennedy, a professor of Islamic studies at St. Andrews University, described his army as a, quote, war band living off the proceeds of pillaging. Abd Allah also used a non-merit-based system for his troops. People were promoted for their political and ethnic connections, and so his military was incapacitated. Prominent potential leaders felt limited and frustrated, and would-be allies were turned into opponents and rebels. Maribel Fierro, in her book Abd al-Rahman III, explains, quote, "There were attempts to assimilate the most important Muwallad rebels, including Umar ibn Hafsun, into the Umayyad army. But they suffered ill treatment and were not allowed to compete on an equal footing with Arabs. Therefore, they realized the limitations to which their origins subjected them, and above all discovered that what the emir offered them was inferior to what they could achieve by acting on their own." End quote. Umar ibn Hafsun, the person that Fierro mentions in this quote, would leave the emir's army and would go on to lead a popular revolt against the Umayyad Emirate. Hafsun's power would swell, and he would soon become a major contender for the throne. Now, rebels were not the only problem. Cities began to break away. Toledo, Seville, Zaragoza, Badajoz, to name a few, were all essentially independent city-states. The emirate was now reduced to the city of Córdoba and the surrounding Campina, or countryside. And then, to make matters worse, external opponents had the initiative. The Christian kingdoms in the north were expanding. In Asturias, the rulers had moved their capital from Oviedo, which was north of the Cantabrian Mountains, down south into Leon, which emphasized their growing influence. But the biggest threat came from North Africa, where in 909, a new and formidable caliphate known as the Fatimids came to power and would become a dangerous rival for anybody who stood in their way. But perhaps the saddest statement of Abd Allah's rule was within the royal family itself. The house of the Umayyad, which had ruled Al-Andalus for 150 years, was now jolted by violent internal discord. Abd Allah had his own brothers executed and then did the same for his own sons. Rahman's father, Muhammad, was ordered to his death when Rahman was only 20 days old. One of the greatest rulers of Islamic Spain never even had a chance to get to know his own father. Abd Allah died on October 16th in the year 912. He made it clear for some time that his grandson was to be the next in line to rule. While he was alive, he'd invite the young Rahman into his own private residence and allowed him to sit on the throne in his absence or during special occasions. The young prince was even given special responsibilities in order to groom him for the role of emir. Surprisingly enough, for a land in such disarray, Abd al-Rahman III's ascension to the throne was not contested, including by those who had been passed over for the role. His family and the upper nobility simply submitted to him with an oath of allegiance, and he was installed as emir. But who was this man? The new emir was remarkable. Physically, he was the embodiment of the mixing of cultures that was Al-Andalus. He had inherited his father's Middle Eastern blood, Islamic religion, and high title, but from his mother, who was a Christian concubine, and his grandmother, who was a Basque princess, he got his blue eyes, fair hair, and fair skin. Chroniclers recalled him as being a really handsome guy. The man was a pious Muslim, but he was able to think beyond the confines of his court, and under his rule, Christians and Jews had the ability to succeed. Indeed, these people were considered dhimmis, or people of the book, which offered them a certain degree of protection. This new ruler had an amazing ability to rule by employing the best and worst aspects of the carrot and the stick. Those who submitted were treated fairly. Many of his defeated rivals found new life in the court of Córdoba, where they were reintegrated as productive members of society, but masterfully separated from their base of support. Those who didn't acquiesce were savagely annihilated, entire families wiped out, castles and homes razed to the ground, and sometimes just to prove a point. And to this end, our emir knew how to raise armies and command them in the field. He was a genius when it came to siege work and would often conduct multiple sieges at once. But what really set him apart was that he would make it a point to make any newly acquired territory or city permanently his own. He would garrison cities and forts with his own troops, install new and loyal governors, and would shuffle these men around, often so that no one got too comfortable in their new roles. Now, this pattern wasn't always consistent, but it really worked for him. His mind seemed to work in a very systematic way. He could identify his main priorities and put off lesser problems in order to achieve his greater goal of unification. Based on his modus operandi, he must have had a master plan from the get-go. Historians even remark that his grand design for Al-Andalus was developed even before his grandfather's death, and Rahman was simply biding his time to spring into action. The emir began by asking all of Al-Andalus to swear an oath of allegiance to him. All the major cities and fortresses did this, even though everybody knew it was just simply lip service. I guess if you didn't go along with it, then you'd be kind of painting yourself a target. But in a greater sense, I think Rahman just wanted to let everybody know that they were now dealing with a new emir in town. As I had mentioned before, the emirate was essentially reduced to Córdoba and its immediate surroundings. Rahman called on all the governors to supply him immediately with soldiers. Loyal troops of the Army of Damascus, as it was known, who were settled near Granada, came to his banner right away, but more were to come. With this force, he began to expeditiously secure the core area around Córdoba. He sent out expeditions to take on the local Berber tribes, systematically defeating one tribe after another. In 913, he sent his forces to capture the cities of Écija, Jaén, and Granada, which encroached on the turf of his greatest rival, Umar ibn Hafsun. More on him in a bit. Later that year, his forces also arrived at the second most prosperous city, Seville. Now, he picked just the right time to arrive. The new emir had an eye for analyzing his opponent's weaknesses. Seville, despite being ransacked by Vikings at one point, had grown to prominence. It was under the firm, almost crushing rule of Ibrahim ibn al-Hajjaj, who was regarded as tough, unflinching, and unwavering battleship of a man who nobody could possibly sway. But he suddenly died, and his family started clawing at one another for succession, and so this was a ripe opportunity. Rahman did what he did best. He laid siege to the city, and the people of Seville were so desperate that they called to Umar ibn Hafsun for help. But he was repulsed by the Cordoban forces, and so in December of 913, Seville surrendered. It was quickly reintegrated, garrisoned, and given a loyal governor. The emir was off to a great start. Now, what if this man, Umar ibn Hafsun? You should go back to my previous episode and hear about this man's early history. It's colorful, to say the least. He started life as a brigand, a murderous thief who would raid the locals from his mountain hideout known as Bobastro. But there was a group known as the Muwalad, and this term applies to either those of mixed ancestry, usually a Muslim father, non-Muslim mother, or descendants of those who had converted to Islam. These Muwalad, who felt like they were being treated like second-class citizens and were severely disaffected by the prior emir's rule, began to support Hafsun, who rose prominently within the political and military realm, eventually finding himself the lord of many castles and leader of a private army, and a very prominent challenger for the throne of the emirate. Indeed, he was so powerful that he and his army advanced on Córdoba in 891, but was narrowly defeated. He converted to Christianity in 899, and as a result lost a considerable amount of support within the Muwalad. But despite this, he still posed a very formidable opposition. In 914, Rahman reopened the offensive in the south. He had already defeated Hafsun's attempt to come to the aid of Seville, but now the new emir was going to take the offensive and hit Hafsun hard. He marched on Malaga, Sidonia, and captured scores of Hafsun's castles. According to later chroniclers, the number of castles taken was a nice even 70. But eventually he took the port city of Algeciras, which is where Hafsun was importing all of his war material from North Africa. Rahman personally watched as all the ships in the harbor and their cargo were set ablaze. By 916, after a famine had ravaged the land, Umar ibn Hafsun pleaded for peace and astonishingly was granted this. He died of natural causes in the year 917, but his sons decided to continue his fight. However, the emir's prestige had exploded. Wherever the emir now went, people were more willing to submit. They knew that they would get a fair shake, but there were still plenty of diehards who required a brutal end that Rahman was willing to firmly deal at a moment's notice. Along the same lines, cities and castles that stood in his way or held the potential for future rebellion were turned into rubble, and this policy continued year after year. Region after region came under his firm control. In 917, Valencia and Tudmir, even Nibla in modern-day Portugal were added. By 922, most of southern Spain was in his hands, including the port of Almeria. And then Rahman decided to settle an old fight. He took his troops to the high mountain fortress of Bobastro, the last remaining bastion of the now deceased Umar ibn Hafsun, which was currently commanded by his son Jafar. And in 3 separate sieges, each one building up from the last in 923, 925, and finally 927, the last siege, Rahman even went so far as to build a competing fortress right next to Bobastro to essentially cut it off from the world. And on January 17th, 928, Bobastro fell, and the last son of Hafsun was taken with his family back to Cordoba. But instead of execution, he was acknowledged for his military prowess and given a position in the army. Rahman had finally done it. He had managed to defeat his greatest rival.